Hello and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. My name is Victoria Brush and I'm a Senior Content Executive for Good Lord. This is a recording of our Experts React webinar addressing the Renters Reform Bill third reading. In this podcast, we'll hear from Ollie Sherlock and Ryan Heaven as they discuss what happened in the third reading of the Renters Reform Bill, how letting agents should be preparing, and what happens next. And now onto the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's instalment of the Renters Reform Bill webinar here at Good Lord. I'm Ollie Sherlock, Managing Director of Insurance here at Good Lord, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Heaven. Good morning, Ryan. How are you?
Right, moment of truth.
Can you see me? Can you
hear me?
Yeah. How are you, Ryan?
Yeah, my heart rate was up for a moment there. We just had I had some technical difficulties. Good Lord did not have any. I did, but we've made it. You can hear me. You can see me. Oh, we're good.
How are you? Are you well?
Yeah, a little bit stressed, but no, I'm well. Other than the technical hiccups, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Quite an interesting session today because, of course, we actually have something to talk about, and that's not to diminish the value that I hope we've given over previous Renters Reform Bill webinars, but indeed, this has been a long process, and actually we've been now through the third reading, and we're going to talk today with Ryan about what that really means and what the results of that third reading are. Before we go into that, Ryan, for those who don't know you, can you just give us a brief insight into your background and what your day job looks like?
Hi, well, my name's Ryan. I'm an associate solicitor at Dutton, Gregory, and we do all things letting law as well as some other non-letting things, if you're interested. I advise lots of letting agents. We do possession work. We do terms of business. That's maybe you've seen Dutton Gregory on the Good Lord tenancy agreements and terms of business. I've been heavily involved in that. That's a little bit about me. And I've also been with you doing these Renters Reform webinars from time to time.
Indeed, and a pleasure it is. And indeed, we're joined by hundreds of letting agents and professionals from across the country. Thank you so much to everyone giving their time to join us today. As always, the Q&A is open throughout. So any questions you have pertaining to any aspect of the conversation, please do put through the Q&A as we go through. We have got a small slot designated for sort of mopping questions up. But if you've joined us before, you'll know that we like to sort of take the questions as we go and try and blend them into the session. It is a webinar, of course, and as Ryan has attested to, there's a chance of technical difficulties, albeit I think Ryan is through those. If we do have any, and we'll be jumping straight back on, we're joined today by Steph, who'll be managing the slides and the overall sort of webinar for us. So any problems, bear with us, but we're hoping not to have any this morning. Okay. So we're going to discuss the Renters Reform Bill. We're going to go through the third reading. Before we do, it's a good opportunity very, very quickly to tell you what Good Lord does. We're a pre-tenancy business that actually supports the compliance process and expediting that process for you on behalf of you for your customers. We can provide services such as landlord terms of business, rent collection, along with the usual that you'd expect from Good Lord, compliant tenancy signing, and really giving you time back to focus on, hopefully, growing your business. And with that in mind, we have products and services that do that, such as rent protection insurance, tenancy services, for example. If you don't know what Good Lord does and you want to assess how that can work for your business, please visit our website at www.goodlord.co, where you can book a demonstration. As with all these webinars, this isn't about Good Lord at all. This is about what's happening in the industry and what's happening from a legislative perspective. And in order to sort of understand that a bit more, we've got a few points we're going to take you through today. So we're going to discuss with Ryan what happened in the third reading and what's happening next. We're going to look at Section 21 and court reform. This was the biggest talking point for some time. It's arguably, Ryan, the biggest talking point in the House when this was discussed. This was the forefront of conversation. There's also a new system of periodic tenancies, which you should be aware of. And we're going to cover any other changes that are meant in the bill. We'll very lightly touch on how agents should prepare. And through this, we're going to blend in what reform looks like from a general election. I fear we may not have time getting through to slide 6. There will be a follow-on webinar, it's worth noting, to really focus on what agents can do to start preparing once we've got a little more confirmation of some of the basis of the bill. It's worth pointing out that at about 4:45, I think it was yesterday, the bill was put up onto the government website. So we've had quite a short amount of time to read through that. And of course, there'll be follow-on sessions to really sort of go through any finer detail. But we have had the chance to get a real good look at it. And we've had a good chance to discuss what some of the permutations of the bill are. And that's exactly what we're going to go through today. So we've got a few questions in already before we even got to slide 1, which is always a good sign. Let me see what you guys want to talk about, Sam. I'm going to let you know if we'll blend this in or we can answer it now. Nicholas asks, good morning, Nicholas. I hope you're well. Please, can you let me know what the notice period will be for students in a HMO once the initial 6 months expires? Right, let's kick off with that.
Sure.
Straight on the spot.
So this I don't know if this has got its own. I can't recall if it's got its own slide or talking piece, but there is a new ground introduced as part of renters reform, which is the student ground, trying to create some certainty about being able to let for a term and then re-let for the next term. The change that happened recently was to remove the requirement for it to be, well, before it was only linked to HMO, so you had to have a licensed HMO, or actually no, not even licensed, just a HMO, which didn't necessarily cover all student lets. So it's now been expanded to any tenancy where you have a full-time student. It's important to clarify full-time, not part-time. The other change was that you had to give prior notice that you were going to rely on this notice. So kind of akin to ground 1 and 2 notices that you have currently. The notice period is 2 months, and the notice can only expire between 1st of June and the last day of September. So because it's a 2-month notice, and because Section 8 notices last for 12 months anyway, you can serve this notice basically at the start of a tenancy. So you enter the tenancy, you would have served the pre-notice, so saying we're going to rely on this notice. You can then serve the notice to say we need possession back between June and September, and that will be sufficient to carry you all the way through. You don't have to wait close to the deadline to do it, and it might be sensible with students in particular to give them as much time as possible to get things in order.
Fantastic. Straight out the gates there, Nicholas, for you. Thank
that's
you.
content.
We've got 2 other questions. We actually, I think, nicely on. I'll start with Emma's. Good morning, Emma. She says, hello. Will we get a copy of these slides, please, after the webinar? You will indeed get a copy of the entire webinar sent to you. So you can replay it if it's that interesting to you, or you can share it with your colleagues and friends, maybe. I don't know. But yes, you will get copies. And Paul asks, which this is a question we're definitely going to come on to, Paul. Once Labour get in to government, I mean, I would say that's a big assumption, but we're going to talk about the possibilities of that, or indeed the guarantees of that. He has to, once Labour get into government and abolish Section 21 notices, what notice will they have to give before it becomes law? 6 months, question mark. Actually, Paul, we've got some really quite insightful information on Section 21, because not all is as it seems. And that is definitely a big topic on today's webinar. So we will come to that, Paul, very shortly. But before we get to that, let's talk about what's actually happened. So we've gone through a number of readings in the House of Commons, Ryan. There's been 3 readings. When we say there's 3 readings, it's not entirely accurate, is it? It's essentially announcements with then actually some more context and substance as the process goes on. And the whole idea of that is that the bill can get scrutinised. Now, this was a manifesto commitment from the Conservative Party. You'll note that we are just short of an election, so they've really sat on this one and really thought about it, and hopefully given a very diligent, detailed, logical plan, given the time it's taken to get to this point. But indeed, it's got to this point. It's at the 3rd reading in the House. It's passed through, and it's actually gone through to the House of Lords. And fully enough, whilst we got the bill from the government website, the House of Lords signifier on the website is showing that it's at 2nd reading. Now, I don't think we're quite sure whether that's accurate or not, Ryan. I don't know if you have any more light on that, because we were of the opinion yesterday that it hadn't had the 1st reading in the Lords, but indeed the government website is saying different. But the process here is to obviously go through this and the House of Lords to do the challenge, or indeed pass the bill through. Now, given this is a manifesto pledge, in reality, we don't expect challenge, albeit Michael Gove was suggesting it could be under scrutiny. We were chatting yesterday, Ryan. We think that's really more tongue-in-cheek, following the Miranda bill back and forth more than anything, don't we?
Yeah, so if you ever see in the news about the House of Lords causing problems for the government, it's because the government's trying to pass something that isn't a manifesto commitment. So Rwanda, the election back in 2019, Rwanda was not on the agenda. So the House of Lords can do whatever they like to that kind of stuff. But this was a manifesto commitment. It does have cross-party support. I can't imagine there'd be any real resistance to it. So I think it's more or less a formality. It will pass through the House of Lords as is.
That said, in more recent times, we've had precedents of precedents not being followed. So who knows? But we're not
unprecedented times. Yeah.
but we're not expecting huge challenge. This has had cross-party support. It's worth noting actually through in anticipation of the third reading, the bill had over 200 suggested amendments, which is quite a lot. And we know that the bill got scrutiny, especially from Conservative backbenchers, and we know that some of the changes were essentially enforced through some of the challenge on that in order to get the bill through. And there's been pressure on the government to deliver this. It's fair to say, as much as I sort of joke about the timeline, the government has had numerous large challenges to face, COVID being one of them, cost of living crisis being another, internal fighting being probably the other thing that has caused quite a delay on these things. And that's the reality of government, right? Like, if they can't act in a meaningful way, in a joined up way, and they become fragmented, things like this that actually are really important do get put on the back burner. And it's fair to say, I think, that this bill has been a symptom of that. But we are here now. We do have a bill. We have something you can go and read. I think over 300 minutes worth of reading. If it so pleases you, listeners and viewers, maybe have a glass of wine, dare I say 3 bottles of wine tonight. But hopefully through today's session, we're going to sort of highlight some of the points that we think are important. Before we do that and we get on section 21, there's a killer question on here that I'm sure, Ryan, everybody wants to know. When will the bill pass?
I don't know. Is the simple and honest answer to this. That it should go through the House Lords quite quickly because it's essentially unopposed. And I think there'll be pressure from the government to get it through as soon as possible so it can they can say that they've done it before the next election. So there's no reason why it should take very long at all. But in terms of time estimates, I'm afraid I truly don't have the inside scoop on that. I would just keep your ear to the ground and just see what murmurings are going on. It's important to say, though, is that this bill, along with most modern forms of legislation, it passing through the Lords and getting royal assent, the law doesn't just start from that day. It gets implemented. The term used in the bill is commencement date, and we're going to use that term quite a lot. The commencement date is set by government at a later stage. So it passing is not necessarily the important thing. It could pass. I mean, don't hold me to this, but if it passes, say, this week, next week, that doesn't necessarily impact on when the commencement date is going to be, which may be later this year, maybe next year. Like I say, I don't have the inside scoop.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, and we said the only thing we're certain is that we're uncertain on this point. But we think that this should go through a quite routine process now. And indeed, if you're thinking about a general election, you're thinking about party politics, I imagine there's going to be quite a strong desire to say that we've delivered on these things. And actually, from a Conservative perspective, it's fair to say they probably need all the help they can get at the moment if the polls are accurate. So, we don't know what the exact date, but I think the general thinking is that this should go relatively quickly. The major point here, as Ryan says, though, is that this being passed doesn't mean this becomes enforced. And I think actually that was one of the things that Michael Gove said on Law Koonsberg probably about a couple of months ago. He guaranteed on that show, let's remind ourselves, guaranteed that Section 21 would be outlawed by ahead of a general election, I think. And being outlawed and being in place and actually workable and actionable are two very different things. And Section 21 is something that actually has seen substantial challenge and change from all quarters. And if we can go on to the next slide, please, Steph. And on that basis, actually looking at where we are now, you could look back at Michael Gove's statements and think that he's absolutely failed to follow through on that very clear promise. Talk us through what's happened here, Ryan.
If I remember the punditry at the time, I think a lot of people placed emphasis on the word outlawed as not necessarily meaning what people thought it meant. Essentially, it's some weasel word where Michael Gove could say with his hands up, well, it has passed the House of Commons and the House of Lords and it has gained royal assent, even if it hasn't kicked in yet, even if we haven't got to the commencement date. So I think it's just a word broad enough in scope that it allows him to backtrack without losing face. But I do think, if I remember rightly, in the last week or so, he said he couldn't guarantee it would go through the House of Lords quickly. So I think he's already backtracking on that. In any event, whenever the election date is, I can categorically confirm there will be some landlords in this country who can serve a Section 21 notice, because of the way in which this is set up. And we'll come to this in a little bit if you like, but it's linked to this idea of the changes being on hold until court reforms happened. Now, it may well be that
let's just summarize on that. Yeah, I think I just I want to sort of summarize the point, because I think most people will be joining this webinar, reading any of the updates, maybe in the industry press or wider media, and they'll be thinking, okay, Section 21 has been kicked down the road. It hasn't been abolished. And they'll be thinking that we're waiting on the courts, waiting on the investigation into the courts in order to understand how they can be fit for purpose. Because let's remind ourselves that the moment we lose Section 21, we then rely on other powers that need court support. And actually, at the moment, I don't think anybody is sat here saying the courts work as it is. Add further weight onto those, and that could be disastrous. So I think that's the general thinking. Now, our esteemed friend Ryan has been doing some further reading on this, and not all is as it seems from your point of view, Ryan, is it? There actually is there's mechanisms within the bill, as you understand them, to actually get ourselves to a place where it's not so clear cut. So, can you talk us through your interpretation of the bill as it stands at the moment? And just to save you a Michael Gove moment, this is your interpretation of the bill as we have it. There's been no absolute guarantee of this position, but I think this is a really interesting take.
The way this is structured, and as I was saying, I don't know if I'd missed something. It's totally possible that maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention prior to it. But my impression of this link to there being an assessment of the courts and delaying the implementation of renters reform until that time, I thought that would basically be there won't be any there won't be any ban or restrictions on Section 21 until that's happened.
Agreed.
But the way it's structured in the bill is different to that. And I think it falls. Actually, let me explain. And I will try and do this bit slowly and carefully, because it did take some time for me to get my head around. If you have a pen to hand, this might be the time to take some notes, because I don't want to have to come back to it once. But you basically got three broad classes of tenancy when it comes to renters reform being implemented. You've got the commencement date. So that will be when the legislation passes, gets royal assent, and the government say it's going to kick in from X date. Now, we don't know when that date is, but mentally mark it as commencement date. The first class of tenancy will be any new tenancy after commencement date will be caught by the new rules.
Let's call that the 1st of September, Ryan. So the viewers and listeners here can sort of plan and plot this back. Fine. So let's call the commencement date hypothetically the 1st of September.
Fine. So if a tenancy starts 2nd of September, then the renters reform rules will apply. That means no Section 21, but you'll have these new grounds, things like that. The second class of tenancy is a fixed term tenancy that starts before commencement date, but goes periodic after commencement date. So let's say a tenancy starts on the 1st of August, lasts for a year, just to save my brain having to do the maths on that. And then it goes periodic. 1st of August next year, the Renters Reform Bill kicks in at that point. So you can serve a Section 21 notice during the fixed term, but you couldn't serve it once it goes periodic, because then that's the point at which it's banned. Those two are, I think, okay, and they're all linked to when the commencement date starts. Tenancy before, then it then is when it goes periodic. Tenancy after, it just applies regardless. Then there's a third class of tenancy, which is basically a tenancy which is already periodic on commencement date. And the only way the Renters Reform Bill is going to apply to that is when the Secretary of State introduces what's called an extended commencement date. So basically like a backstop, if you want to use that terminology, saying all tenancies are caught at this point. Now, the way in which the court assessment has been structured is the court assessment prohibits the government from introducing that backstop until there has been an assessment. And then you would assume from the assessment taking place, you'd also need things like maybe some reforms to actually take place. And then the Secretary of State needs to be content that the reforms are okay and the court's in good enough condition to do it. And then they'll introduce a date. But that court reform is only linked to that third class of tenancy. So the other two types, the new tenancies after and the existing tenancies that go periodic after commencement date, those are not tied to the court reforms at all. They will just apply, the new rules will just apply to them regardless of the condition of the court. And the scope to serve a Section 21 notice on that second class of tenancy, the fixed term, that will end as soon as the tenancy goes periodic. So you need to be really aware of that class of tenancy. Now, part of the concern here is that if we have a commencement date in, say, the next 12 months, if you set up a tenancy today, then it could well be that the landlord doesn't have a choice about whether or not renters reform is going to apply to it or not, because we don't know when the commencement date is going to be, and it may be entirely outside of our control. This might lead us into a bit of advice later on, because throughout all of these webinars, I think there's always been a slide which has said, what should landlords be doing to prepare? And I think what landlords should be doing to prepare for this is try and get their tenancies into the third class of tenancies, being a periodic when commencement date comes. That's basically saying don't do any renewals. If you can get your tenancy into the third class of tenancy, then you'll be able to serve a Section 21 notice until the backstop kicks in, and that's the thing that's been deferred more or less indefinitely. So if a landlord wants to use Section 21 for the longest possible time, they've got to let tenancies go periodic and do not renew them. Any new tenancies, I think you're just taking the chance, really, because you don't know when the commencement date is going to be.
And on that point, we've got quite a few questions which we expected on this, because
I bet
because I think it's quite a big difference to what I think people thought, where people thought we were. I think as well, the idea, I think nobody disagreed with the idea around the courts, frankly being reformed and invested in, but that isn't doing this. This is adding more pressure through a tranche of tenancies straight away from what you've said there, if this is accurate. So we'll come on to the sort of the repercussions of this shortly, but let me cover some questions while we do. We've got a couple of similar questions, so I'm going to try and tie these together. We've got one from Toby. Good morning, Toby. And I've got another one here from, I've just seen it pop up. Let me see if I can find it. From actually somebody who's not left their name, but good morning nonetheless. And the questions are very similar. Toby asks, on Ryan's second class of tenancy, can we sign up for another fixed term agreement? And the other similar question here, Ryan, is pertaining to the fact that could they sign another fixed term before? If you have a fixed term tenancy and renew for another fixed term after the commencement date, would you still be able to serve Section 21? So where do people sit on that from your understanding?
Now, so this is something I think we need to look at, and I don't think I could give 100%. I'm not as certain on this point as I am on the others, because if we're saying a fixed term converting to periodic means that new rules apply, the new rules include the provision that you can't create fixed term contracts. So if we're saying the new rules don't apply until it goes periodic, I think there is a case to say, well, then you can just create a new renewal, can you not? But like I said, I don't think I've got a certain point on this. It took me quite a long time to get to the bottom of the extended commencement date point, to be honest with you. And we've only recently got a nice clean bill to go through. Before then, I was having to trawl through the amendments and piece things together. It was horrendous. But I definitely think there's scope to look into that point. And I think we're probably going to do another webinar, because I don't think we can do everything we want to do in an hour on this one. In which case, I promise you, I will look into the idea that you could extend a fixed term tenancy because the new rules haven't applied. I don't think it will work. And I think this is just my gut, by the way, not really an informed legal opinion. I don't think it'll work because a renewal will count as a new tenancy, and that will make
and that would have to be in a short tenancy
class.
Yeah.
So I don't think you could create that new tenancy once the commencement is started.
I think you're probably right. But again, we will continue to go through the bill and seek advice on these things as well. Sorry, you're going to say, Ryan?
Yeah, no. So there is like another point to that, which is, what if you just create a really long fixed term? So like if you know commencement day is coming, then you can just sign up to say a 5-year fixed term, and you can serve maybe a Section 21 notice at the end of that. The trouble is, if the backstop kicks in at some point, that's the point at which you can't serve a Section 21 notice anymore. And if you're still in the fixed term, then you're stuck, aren't you? So if you were going to create a very long fixed term to try and bridge the gap slightly, because I'm mindful that letting agents earn money from renewals, if you wanted to create that long fixed term, then you would almost certainly want that long fixed term to have some kind of break clause in it. So that if you do get the backstop extended commencement date coming in, the break clause will allow you to serve a Section 21 notice midterm. Otherwise, if you've still got another 2 years left to run, that Section 21 notice isn't going to do you any good.
Yeah, and I voiced before sort of the renewal process being omitted out of new legislation is a bit of a kick for letting agents, because that is a revenue line. It's also an important way to reset values with the landlord, with the tenants, etc. But not only that, and Lou makes a very good point here. And good morning, Lou. Lou says also, I understand the advice, are we not renewing? But I've never done so many renewals as all of our tenants want the security of another fixed term. And I think that's a really, really important point, and one that the bill and DLUC and legislators have failed to acknowledge, that actually a fixed term contract does give tenants, a proportion of tenants anyway, security and peace of mind. And this move to an assured tenancy world, essentially, and we'll come on to the permutations of that, because actually it's now a minimum term of 6 months as per the bill, which is slightly more security for all parties than they had, but it does remove that security that tenants have. So, Lou, to that point, I think you're gonna have to watch and follow this very, very closely, to ensure that you're not putting yourself in a position by doing and renewing those contracts that then removes any peace of mind or perceived security that landlords have by having access to Section 21. And of course, we've talked before, Ryan, of Section 21. It's an important point. It's been a big talking point, but there are devices that can give landlords a point of exit as and when necessary, in line with the new legislation, which again we'll come on to. Let me just go through some more questions while we're on this subject. David asks, does Ryan class both statutory and contractual periodic tenancies in the same bracket in terms of the significance of the commencement date?
Now, bear with me here. I might actually need to read the legislation, because there is a specific point about when something is classed as going periodic. So I'll tell you what, I will keep a tab open in the background, and I'll try and answer that question for you.
While you're looking at that, I can take one of the questions here. This is from somebody who hasn't left their name, but good morning to you. Can we put rent reviews in the periodic tenancies from the beginning? The rent review legislation, as far as I'm aware, hasn't changed as per the bill. So you can review the rent on an annualized basis, but it has to be within the parameters of what I think it actually was first included in the white paper, followed through all readings, wasn't challenged. So it's got to be within the same process we've talked about before. So yes, you will continue to do a rent review on the property on a yearly basis. It has to be in line with the market, and tenants do have the right to appeal that and essentially take that and challenge, and that will then reflect in terms of what the market is doing. So any unproportionate rent increases, I think I'm right in saying, Ryan, run the risk of being essentially thrown back to the landlord / letting agent at that time. But it's once a year over a period of 12 months, as I understand it, Ryan.
Yeah, it's the current Section 13 process.
We say current, but
I think
Section 13 isn't actually used right on hardly any rent increases from a contractual perspective.
Yeah, no, exactly. There are other options to increase the rent presently, so letting agents don't often use them. I would expect the tribunal to be getting a great deal more work, because landlords lose nothing by serving a Section 13 notice, and tenants lose nothing by contesting it. So
that we know of at the moment. I mean, that's we've talked before about this, and I think the biggest fear, it's probably one of you that I cited, was the first tier tribunal funding and size isn't maybe fit for purpose for what's coming their way. I've not seen any updates. I've not seen any detail around further investment in the first tier tribunals. I've not seen also any other penalties for for mischallenges. There's no deterrence, as you say, for doing this time and time and time again and just holding up the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar sort of thing to deposit disputes, really. It doesn't cost the tenant anything. So worst case scenario, they get exactly the same outcome they would have get if they hadn't disputed anything. Best case scenario, they get a discount. So there's no reason not to do it. And like I said about the court reform, and the courts broadly cover the tribunal service as well, the new rules are going to apply, and all these new Section 13 notices are going to go towards the tribunal. And that's not going to be after an assessment that's taken place as to the tribunal's ability to handle that. I have got an answer to the periodic tenancy question, by the way.
Fantastic.
If I could read verbatim, for the purposes of a subsection, an assured tenancy is converted to a periodic tenancy if and when it becomes a periodic tenancy on the expiry of a fixed term. I would say that covers both contractual and statutory periodic, because the contractual periodic part only happens after a fixed term has ended. So I think they've worded that in quite an elegant way.
Indeed. And let me just go back to the questions here. At 10:17, Nav, good morning, Nav, said, hello, Nav here. Surely court reform is going to take such a long time that Section 21 will never be abolished. Hopefully, in the last 17, 20 odd minutes.
Agreed. That's exactly what this is. So the issue I'm trying to raise really is about, I think a lot of people thought that the scope of this deferral would apply to more tenancies than it is. And actually, if you have that third class of tenancy, if you're waiting for the backstop, that could be years down the line. Now, we have to have one eye on a possible change of government, and they might have different priorities about this, and that's its own talking point, I think. But essentially, by deferring it to court reform, and the wording of again, I'm going to quote something else verbatim here, which I've wrote down if I can try and find it. The Lord Chancellor, who's basically chief lawyer, has to do a report, and the timing of the report is at such time as the Lord Chancellor thinks appropriate. So not within 18 months or by the end of the parliamentary session or any kind of deadline at all. It's just whenever you get around to it. So this is an indefinite deferral, an indefinite in the sense of we cannot define when it's going to end. And even the court report isn't necessarily going to trigger that backstop date being set, because the court report might say we need X billion more pounds to go into the court. We need to see improvements X, Y, Z. There might be all kinds of things which stem from the report, which stops the backstop from being set.
But if I've understood that correctly, though, that's only pertinent to one of those tranches of tenancies. So,
correct. Yeah.
And this is where we probably get into the more opinion-led conversation. I'm struggling to understand the logic. If the courts aren't fit for purpose, which, we cover nearly, if not over, £1 billion of annualised rent here at Good Lord. We see the court processes and we see the timings held up. Just to process a case at the moment, it's weeks and weeks and weeks, depending which part of the country that you're in. But if the government is saying, and this was the reason that was labelled at the time, that we're not going to surge forward this because the courts need this assessment and we think they need investment. I don't think, like I've said, any of us disagree with that. But this bill allows two of the three tranches of tenancies to essentially fall under the new legislative change, which is abolishing Section 21, which in that time between those tenancies starting or them becoming a periodic tenancy, for example, a new tenancy starting, there will be problems. There will be things that go wrong. There will sections that will need to be served, and they will have to be served in place of what would have been probably a Section 21 before. That's going to add to the problem within the courts. Which at the same time we're saying, hang on a minute, we're assessing whether the courts are fit for purpose. And until then, this third tranche of tenancies can't possibly happen. If they take ages to do this, natural evolution of tenancies is going to catch up with them. And we end up in a position where Section 21 is for some abolished, for some not. But the courts are no further forward, no better off. And frankly, will deal with more cases, certainly in the first 12 to 18 months, if not longer.
It does seem like landlord and tenant groups could look at this and say it's the worst of all worlds, because you have the first two categories of tenancies where the rules are just going to apply regardless of the court rules, which isn't what landlords and the backbenchers were fighting for. But then you have this third class of tenancy, which is what organisations like the Renters Reform Coalition are going to say, well, these guys could be served a Section 21 notice years from now, even after they've kind of officially been abolished. And it's not going to be the tenant's fault, but they're in this kind of tenancy. If a landlord doesn't want to renew that tenancy, just wants to let it go periodic, the tenant's stuck. I mean, obviously the tenant could serve notice and leave if they wanted to, but Section 21 notices will not have been banned if it's possible for some tenants to still be served with Section 21 notices.
I think we've ended up, if what we're saying here is absolutely correct, and we're going to get further context, and Ryan, I'm sure we're working with himself and his colleagues and wider partners to really ratify this understanding. But this is the interpretation of the wording. This is accurate. We've ended up with a fragmented and possibly more convoluted result than any of us possibly could have imagined. And to your point,
it's two tiers, really.
Yeah. I don't understand how that helps anybody. Tenants, landlords, letting agents, courts. I really struggle to understand how that's a positive outcome.
If I am being optimistic, then I will say that it can only ever be a temporary thing, because there must at some point be an end to it, and this is really just a transition from one phase to another. I think you must have had, I mean, it was before my time, but you must have had a similar sort of thing when rent act tenancies came to an end and assured tenancies came in. You still have rent act tenancies; they still exist, and they have to be treated and ended under separate rules. You may well end up with the same sort of thing where you're, 4 or 5 years down the line, if the Secretary of State hasn't introduced this backstop yet, then you would still have ASTs that can still be ended on Section 21 notices.
Very, very interesting. And hopefully to all of you watching and listening, that was insightful. A couple of questions come in ongoing from this point, which is absolutely understandable. Ricky asks, good morning, Ricky. Can you increase the rent if the tenancy moves to a periodic basis, Ryan?
No, I don't think so, because when it goes from periodic, it will be under the new rules, in which case it would just be Section 13 notices. So you can serve a Section 13 notice when it goes periodic, but I don't think you can do anything to set that before.
No, yeah, my understanding would be that if you choose that to be the point in which you serve a Section 13, so be it. But that indeed is that annual cycle complete at that stage.
Thinking out loud, you could just create a new tenancy at an increased rent. That would be permissible to do, but it requires the tenant to obviously agree to that, and they might not.
And depending when, would depend on either an assured tenancy or an AST, right? Depending when Ricky was to do this.
A new tenancy. So a new tenancy. If we're saying this discussion is taking place post commencement date, so when this fixed term tenancy ends, it's going to have the new rules apply to it. Yeah. There wouldn't be any issue creating a new tenancy so long as it is governed by the new rules. And that new tenancy, I don't see any reason why that couldn't be at an increased rate. Because until it goes periodic, the new rules do not apply. I think there's almost just a bit of a song and a dance going on about what can be done and when. But if you're too late to discuss it before it goes periodic, you will at least be able to serve Section 13.
Yeah, and somebody sort of follows up to this point who hasn't left their name, but good morning to you. If rent increase agreement is agreed without a Section 13, does that mean the AST is auto renewed and therefore falls into the new world?
So a rent increase generally doesn't count as a new tenancy, but I suppose it depends on when you are agreeing this. So as I said, if you're agreeing it within a fixed term post commencement date, I think that would be okay because you're still under the old rules. But I don't think you can agree a higher rental without it, though. That is because this wasn't something that was really brought up in the in any of the amendments. I've got to be honest, I haven't actually looked too much at the mechanism for increasing rent, so I might just need to keep one on my notes when Ollie's next monologuing.
So let's move on from Section 21. Please do, if you've got any further thoughts, any questions, please do raise them. We're going to, as we go through and get closer and closer to the commencement date, we're going to be obviously hopefully supporting you and passing on any insights that we have. So there'll be a couple of these webinars to follow up. But let's look at some of the wider changes, and one of those, indeed, it's been quite pertinent actually to the conversation we've just had, which is the new system of moving away from an short hold tenancy into an assured tenancy. Talk us just through and summarise what that change is, just to remind people what we're talking about here, which probably sheds a bit of light on some of the answers that you've given as part of the Section 21 debate.
Fine. So just some key points. No fixed terms, so that's the rolling tenancy aspect of it. Tenants can serve notice at any time during the tenancy, but that notice cannot expire within the first 6 months of a new tenancy. If you So if you have a tenancy that predated the commencement date, then the 6 months kind of counts, or it has been counted already. But for new tenancies starting afterwards, completely new and fresh tenancies, there's this 6 month window where the tenant's notice cannot expire. It can be served, but it cannot expire. The other pertinent part of these rolling tenancies is to do with the rental period. So the most rent you can take is either 28 days or a month. You can't have these quarterly, 6 monthly annual rent payments anymore, or termly, even if you're dealing with students. I know a lot of landlords take things termly because they know when student loan payments come into tenants' bank accounts.
And what about from an upfront perspective, Roy? We've got tenants who are coming in, for example, from overseas. They can't pass tenant referencing. All parties are happy to commence on the basis they pay their rents up front. What would letting agents do in that circumstance?
So this doesn't feel like it's, well, okay, I'll explain. The rules as written are saying that you can only have these rental periods of 28 days or a month at most. The law as written doesn't necessarily prevent a tenant from being in credit, if you see what I mean. So like if you sign a tenant up to a monthly rent and they just happen to overpay, and just say, oh, we'll just give you 3 months. I mean, I'm not saying this is something that currently happens very often, but let's just say there's no law against a tenant being in credit for their rent. Doesn't happen often, but it could. In that sense, if a tenant were to pay 12 months rent up front, that wouldn't be prohibited. It's just that you couldn't require them to do it. So I don't know. It seems to me as though there's maybe scope to argue that if you're basically saying, yeah, the rental period is a month, but actually I want you to pay 12 months of that in one lump sum, that's skirting around it. I don't see that that's expressly prohibited, but I also think that's definitely not in keeping with the spirit of the law, and I would expect that to get, if it's not already going to be, clamped down on. Like I say, I think that's just an interpretation, well, certainly my interpretation of or just trying to dig down into loopholes, because if you're not a lawyer who has fun digging into loopholes, I think you're in the wrong job. But I think there's a potential loophole there.
Okay. And on that basis, Claire asks a more personal question to students. Good morning, Claire. Does that mean for students who do not have guarantors, we can no longer, obviously post-commencement days, we can no longer accept the full rent in advance? Is there any difference of opinion here with students, or is it exactly the same across the board for all tenancies?
Yeah, so we were talking about this yesterday. So yes, you can't demand it up front as written. You can only take payments on a monthly basis. Now, if you have a UK guarantor, that's fine. What we were discussing yesterday is, what about the foreign student market? Because it seems like then your options are only to take the rent monthly, in which case it's a student you don't know if they're going to pay, or you have an overseas guarantor, and the practicalities of enforcing against an overseas guarantor are that it's prohibitively expensive and difficult to do. So if you have a foreign student, I don't really know what you're meant to do other than be incredibly quick in your response if a rent payment is missed, because the only leverage you've got to get that rent paid is whilst they're in the property and their parents don't want to see their precious little child get evicted because they haven't paid the rent. So that's the only leverage. Once that student has left, and indeed if they leave back to the country they came from, the prospects of recovery are basically nil.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you're meant to do other than be quick on the trigger. That's the best advice I could give about it, to be honest. It seems like I say, I think it's the existence of scenarios like this that makes me think it might be possible to take credit of rent in advance. As I say, the legislation doesn't expressly ban that. It just says the periods can't be longer than a month.
And to your point, there will be challenge that comes post that, right, from different sides, depending. I imagine Citizen Advice and Shelter will have a view on this, for example, in line with the wording exactly. And I imagine many tenants will want to actually take your view on the world, because it means that they can secure a property. And I think it's just before I commence on another question, I think it's worth pulling out our view a little bit here, just reflecting on why this is all happening. The point of the bill was to make a fairer PRS, was to give tenants a better standard of living through a robust and meaningful decent home standard, and making the playing field more level between tenants and and landlords. It's stuff like this, and it's stuff like some of the amendments that were suggested, which thankfully haven't made it in, around abolishing guarantors. Even that was one of the 200 amendments suggested. It's stuff like this that actually is limiting potentially access people to property, not encouraging it. And I think it makes it, if that law is to be followed, actually, we know firsthand from looking from referencing data, and we've got anecdotal evidence on the chat and questions now, that people would struggle then to be able to commit a property on their landlord's behalf to a tenant because of that changing legislation. I think that's maybe an oversight potentially, but I appreciate the bill's trying to cover all bases with very little detail actually, and actually some of that will come. Lily makes this point. Good morning, Lily. We have a lot of people that fail referencing, and we then ask for 6 months up front. She's asking, how do we get around this? I think hopefully Ryan's answered that question, is that there could be a loophole here, but we're not 100% sure there is, and that may be problematic. So I think, given that we're in a supply and demand imbalance at the moment from a property perspective, and that isn't going to change anytime quick, ultimately, one could argue, well, there's plenty of tenants out there for the property, and hey, so be it, such is life. But some of these mechanisms will have a real effect on a certain cohort of tenants.
Whilst I'm looking, in fact, there is so Section 9 of Renters Reform is titled Repayment of Rent Paid in Advance. It doesn't necessarily answer the question. It's basically to say, if they paid, say, if a tenant's paid, say, a 4 months rent and their notice period ends halfway through, there's an obligation to repay part of that rent, which is fine. But I think what it does do is it suggests the concept of the government is comfortable with rent being paid in advance. But I don't know if that rent payment in advance here, to me, in the scenario I just outlined, that just suggests like a normal rent payment, doesn't it? And so in this sense, rent is paid in advance as opposed to in arrears.
Exactly.
Rather than taking 6 or 12 months rent up front. It's not necessarily the same advance.
Well, my read on it is that rent is classed as a period of 28 days or a month, and it's payable in advance. I think rent in advance in the bill is referring to that rather than rent in advance of 6 or 12 months and covering these bases potentially. Yeah. But to your point, you've got wording there that there could be a loophole, there could be which then could enforce further clarification. Which again, anything grey in a bill is really unhelpful for all of us, for all parties, tenants included. We all really are seeking certainty, and whilst we have a little bit more certainty on numerous areas of the bill as it's come out, actually things like this are still sort of wanting a bit more clarity. I've got a question just coming from Grant, Ryan. Good morning. Will there be a removal of the joint and several wording in student contracts, i.e. if a student serves notice, do all students then need to leave post 6 months? If joint and several was in place, then the other students would need to pay the other students' rent.
Good point. So the way in which joint and several currently works is that if a tenant can give valid notice, so let's say it's a periodic contract or something like that, they are able to sever their liability for it. It doesn't end the entire tenancy necessarily. They are just taken from it, and then I guess the law kind of creates a new tenancy with everyone who's left over. Nothing needs to be done necessarily to formalize that, but that's how the law presently operates. I don't recall seeing anything in here that changes that, because tenants have always been able to give notice in a periodic contract. The only real change is that it's always a periodic contract. So I think, in the absence of anything else, and like I said, can't recall spotting anything about it, I don't think there's any change to joint several liability. Just one tenant could leave, which then I guess puts the burden on the other ones. The other thing to bear in mind here is that if you're dealing, let's say, the student example, and each one of those students has a guarantor, the tenant might give their notice, but the guarantor is still attached to the tenancy. They're guaranteeing the tenancy. So yeah, I don't think there's any real changes in that sense.
Okay, and hopefully that answers your question too. I think which was of a very similar nature. Simeon says, but if they pay more rent up front, so they're in credit, in inverted commas, as you state, but you can't take more than 28 days or a month, which we've also said, then would the agent not need to protect it as a deposit if they're holding requested tenant money, and then you're exceeding deposit caps?
I think either you're overthinking it, or I have explained it poorly. So the changes in renters reform are basically talking about rental periods. They're saying you can't have a rental period of more than 28 days or a month. I'm talking about there isn't anything explicit in here saying that you couldn't take multiple of those periods up front. So if they are in credit, I don't think that would count as a deposit or anything like that, because they're paying rent, not the deposit.
But as it is today and moving forwards, you can't enforce these things, right? I mean, from a tenant fee act perspective, that would surely contravene part of the tenant fee act. A tenant could choose to. They can say, if I want this property and I'm willing to pay 12 months up front, and there might be a way around that. But I think there's a few different forces at play here, isn't there, that potentially cross over that the agencies need to be careful of.
Yeah, we haven't talked about front loading in the context of the Tenant Fees Act, which is obviously taking a bulk payment, which is different to other periods. So again, the way in which I'm imagining this loophole working is you're not taking a bulk payment, you're simply taking 12 separate installments of the rent up front. But those periods and those payments are all equal. So it's not front loading in a way which should contravene the Tenant Fees Act.
Yeah, okay. And just to cap 6 months, to cap the periodic tenancy piece off, there was a real fear for many going into the third reading that, and through the whole bill actually, that this move to periodic tenancies would see tenants being absolutely transient, with the ability to move into a property and move straight out again. Essentially, what we're seeing now is a minimum term of 6 months, isn't it, Ryan? Can you just sort of simplify that and explain why that is for our listeners?
Fine. So if you've got a tenancy to which the new rules apply, obviously a landlord cannot serve a Section 21 notice, so that's out the window. But the landlord's got no mechanism to end the tenancy unless there is a Section 8 notice ground satisfied. This is linked to one of the amendments, which is the tenant's notice. So if the tenant was able to give notice at any time and that notice could expire at any time, there is now an amendment to say that notice cannot expire in the first 6 months of a tenancy. And that notice has to be at least 2 months long. So tenant on day one could give a notice that they want to leave, but they would be responsible for rent and all the contractual liabilities up until the end of month 6.
Fantastic. And we've actually covered on this next slide the upfront payment piece. It's been a nice segue into that point. And there are other areas of the bill that there's been changes and amends to. I thought it's worth putting out the decent home standard, because this is something that, right, has been included in the bill as a provision, but essentially, as per my understanding, gives the power to revisit this point and add further sort of direction and guidance under the existing bill that's going to proceed. So essentially, it's coming. It's possible that it comes as part of the bill, but there's little confirmation around anything meaningful from a decent home standard perspective from what we've seen so far. Is that the right reflection?
Yeah, so the way this is structured is you have some sections in here which basically say the Secretary of State has got powers to introduce things later down the line, and you do have an entire schedule in the Renters Reform Bill which sets out some of those changes. But this is something that's introduced separately. It's not going to start on commencement day, unless they do something to introduce it on commencement day. So what I'm trying to say is it's its own thing. It isn't something to necessarily worry or think about too much right now.
And ultimately, this definitely will go down to whoever comes into power next, right? That's not going to be something that we're going to see in the next X amount of months. It's probably going to be over the course of years, and there's provision there in order to sort of give or roll out a hopefully what would be a robust, decent home standard for all parties. The other concern, and this was a real concern, I think one of the most logical ones, was around student properties and student possession grounds and their tenancy terms. If I remember rightly, in the I think it was the white paper, the provision for the difference in tenancy makeup, as it were, actually only applied to PBSA, so purpose-built student accommodation. There's been changes here, hasn't there, since, and the bill has reflected on some of the pushback and amendments. So can you just talk us through what's happening with students from a tenancy perspective and indeed possession grounds?
Yeah, you're quite right. So the white paper made it so it's only student developers that could use this ground. In the bill, it changed to HMOs. So that's obviously broader than just student developers. And the latest version is simply removing the HMO condition entirely. So basically, if a landlord is letting to a full-time student, they can use the new student ground. I did touch on this in the intro, so I won't dwell too much more on that one. Other than we were discussing yesterday about the talking point here with students, which is as a solicitor, my firm do possession work, and we work for student providers of accommodation. We don't often evict students. They usually leave of their own accord. But why the student bodies were kind of fighting to either have special fixed terms for students, which didn't make it into the bill, by the way. So fixed term for students, that's gone as a concept. But you have got this ground instead. It's important for students who will, just by their nature, be probably coming to their first tenancy ever and won't necessarily understand the rules or obligations of it. And if they are given a periodic contract that could essentially last forever, they perhaps need to know there is a date on which that contract ends and they're expected to vacate. So what I would expect student landlords to be doing, even if they don't presently, because I mean, let's think about it currently, student landlords aren't serving Section 21 notices en masse to ensure that they can get the property back by September. They're not doing that. They could, but they're not, because students usually leave. What you maybe need to do, this is almost like a guiding thing. So it might be sensible to serve these notices on students just so they understand that they are expected to leave in the summer. They'll probably leave in the summer anyway, but I don't think a landlord could take a chance on the property not being fit for occupation in September. And then you're hoping then they leave in accordance with the notice, because that's more or less just maintaining what currently happens, which is that students don't tend to overstay their welcome.
Yeah.
If they do overstay their welcome, you actually need to go to court on that ground. You're not going to get the property back by September. There's no way that's happening. So you're really hoping the students are going to do what they're meant to do. And I mean, I deal with all kinds of kind of different markets within the PRS, and I deal with some not retirement homes, but kind of retirement homes. And from my experiences, the real troublemakers are the old people. I can't recall the last time I had to evict a student for antisocial behaviour, maybe 2 years ago. But old people, let me tell you, they get up semantics.
I take that quite personally, Ryan. But coming from a very young buck like you. But no, I think that's fair. I'm conscious of time. I've got 2 minutes out. There will be maybe subjects you want us to go into more detail. There'll be maybe things you want more clarity on. We will be running more sessions like this, so please do reach out to us as to what you want us to focus on. Hopefully, that's a relatively good overview of what kind of the pertinent changes, some of the talking points. We do have some questions just to run through very quickly, if that's all right, Ryan. So I just want to fire a few at you that have come in, try and cover them as much as we possibly can. Let me have a look where we are. Somebody who hasn't left their name, but good morning to you nonetheless. After the 6 months, I think this is relating to the now sort of minimum term of 6 months, do tenants still have to give 2 months notice or one, Ryan?
That comes down to the contract. I will say that any contract I'm drafting, I'm going to require 2 months notice. But it's negotiable. Okay.
Ricky asks, can you still do a license to allow for a fixed period and notice?
If you're creating a license, I think it's because you're trying to circumnavigate the rules. So to create a license, without getting too law school here on you, you need a real reason to create a license. You can't just create as an AST and then just cross out the words AST and write license on it. It doesn't really work like that. You have to be providing some kind of service, usually, for a tenant to be on a license, whether that's or basically meaning someone could go into that person's property at any time and just and clear up. So it's possible to create a license, but I don't think most commercial letting agents are creating licenses unless they're trying to skirt the rules, and that's not sensible.
Another question in from somebody who hasn't left their name. Good morning. Will new tenancy agreement terms need to be assessed, and new agreements wording need to be done when renters reform starts? I mean, yes, right. It's a different type of tenancy. It's an assured tenancy. And pitch alert and warning here. One of the good reasons that good law customers will not have to worry. Those tenancies will automatically be updated to ensure that they're in line with the legislation. Our letting agents will not have to lift a finger on that basis, unless indeed they want to use their own contracts. So apologies, that was an unruly pitch there.
I was going to pitch as well, to be honest. I've already prepared prepared a template which is renters reform ready, and I'll be working with Good Lord to ensure their template is renters reform ready as well. The changes aren't quite as big as you might think, but you've got to deal with the fundamental things like, for example, no more fixed term. You've got to have a pet clause in there, but it's not actually as big of a change as you might expect.
Yeah, and there are other areas of this bill which we'll come on to. I think we've covered quite a bit in previous webinars around pets, and that's, for example, around sort of rent arrears and the new clauses around that, and what that looks like. We will revisit those. I think, to summarise, we are now in a period of change, and we know this is happening. Exactly when, we don't know, but it's definitely coming. As we said, it sits in the House of Lords at the moment. We don't expect that to be an overly lengthy process. And one could argue there is more risk attached to such change. So I think my advice is, if you're unsure of any element of this, please do reach out to the likes of ourselves, the likes of Ryan and his business, and try and get some guidance and support. You're not on your own with this stuff, and there's tech, there's partnerships and people and businesses that can really support you as an agency and professionals to ensure you're in the best possible place. And I promise you, if this is confusing for all of us, imagine how landlords feel, because this is an absolute minefield. And I would argue, being a landlord today, they have an absolute necessity to have the support from letting agencies. I think letting agencies become more and more important as we go through changes like this. So if we can support you to realise that importance and educate your landlords and win more landlords, hopefully that's a positive thing. So change is coming, but as most of our sort of t-shirts say that we passed out, keep calm, carry on letting, and we'll be back with you hopefully in coming weeks to revisit some of these subjects as we get more clarity. But for now, Ryan, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really insightful stuff, especially around Section 21. I think that would hopefully people leave this webinar a bit more informed on those changes than maybe they entered it. And to all of the people, the hundreds of people that have joined us today, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate that you're busy, really appreciate you joining today. So thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Ollie. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers now. Take care. Bye-bye.